Hi guys, Mrs. Horman again. Here we are with our next section of Global Contemporary, which on your grade sheet is Global Contemporary 4. And this will be for our second section of Global Contemporary, which will be 4, 5, and 6. And so what you see here is the very first entry for today, which is actually one that I love. And I keep saying that a lot for Global Contemporary, and it is because probably many Global Contemporary pieces attempt to confront a larger problem, places where people have been mistreated or taken advantage of, or it's a larger scale of basically abuse of regular people by governments or people in power. And so what you see here is a piece that has a very simple name, but then a more complex subtitle or secondary title. So the title of the piece is Trade, but then when you look at the completed title, it is Gifts for Trading Land with White People. And so when you're looking at it, the very first thing you know is that it is Native American. And you know this because, gifts for trading land with white people. That's something that Native Americans did during the beginning of colonization. And then you read down to see who your artist is, and it's Jean Quick to See Smith. And so who she is she is Native American. The word Jean is French for yellow because she has French Cree ancestry. She is also a member of what are called the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Nation. Her grandmother was a Shoshone, and her grandmother is the one who gave her her middle name, Quick to See. And so what you see here is she's called Yellow to remind her of her French ancestors and that her skin color is not the same skin color as, the white people. Quick to See, her grandmother gave her because as a child, Jean seemed to pick up on things very quickly. She understood things much faster than her brothers and sisters. She was very smart. And so this is her name. So her father was not literate. She grew up in a reservation, Native American reservation. Her father was not literate, but he valued education immensely and made sure that Jean went to school. She not only went to regular school, but she also then went to art school, where she studied some of the people that we have studied, particularly de Kooning. So if you remember Woman 1, he is one of her inspirations. And the reason I start talking about that before I talk about the piece is I want you to think about that piece with the concept of de Kooning in the background. I also want you to pay attention to the date, 1992. This piece was created as a response to the anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in North America. And in 1992, there was so much about Christopher Columbus coming and discovering America, and Christopher Columbus coming and, discovering this, and how Christopher Columbus brought, this to that. And as a reaction to this sort of, saintliness that was happening at the time of Christopher Columbus, how everyone spoke about him in such, positive phrases, she created this in response. And it was part of what was called the quincentenary, which is 500th anniversary, the quincentenary non-celebration, where Native Americans, purposefully made sure that during the quincentenary of Columbus's arrival in, what he would call the New World, that we think about what his arrival did to the people who already live here. And so let's skip down one more and say Oil and Mixed Media on Canvas. It's a huge piece. It's 5 feet tall at its largest with and 14 feet long. And the first thing that you see there is you should see the canoe, typical Native American way of transportation in the at the time that Columbus would have been here. And so what you see is this canoe with this backdrop of green, which is the land, and yellow, which is sort of the yellowy brown, which is sort of the skin color, and the red, which is clearly indicative of blood. Good job. And so what she does here, and what the mixed media is not only the oil painting that she does on the large canvases, but on top of the large canvases, there is collage, newspaper articles, magazines, pictures, and things like that. And hanging above it are trinkets or tchotchkes or items that we will talk about in a second. And so this is really a piece that is meant to illustrate both historical and also contemporary inequalities between Native Americans and the rest of the United States, particularly the United States government. There are lots of things that if you live on an Indian reservation, I'm sorry, that was rude. If you live on a Native American reservation, that you cannot do. Native Americans were the last people in the United States to receive the right to vote, and so her purpose is to point out these iniquities. So trade, gifts for trading land with white people. So we're thinking about the purchase of Manhattan. It references the role of trade goods in historical events. We think about the fact that when settlers came to Manhattan, the Dutch paid 60 guilders, which is not that much money, for the entire island of Manhattan. And in doing that, they really took advantage of the Native Americans. They took a huge piece of land for very little money. And so when Smith showed this piece for the first time, she said, and this is a quote from her, so I'm going to read it directly from her. She said that if trade could speak, it might say, quote, "Why won't you consider trading the land we handed over to you for these silly trinkets so that so honor us? Sounds like a bad deal? Well, that's the deal you gave us." And so now we can start talking about what we're looking at. So we're looking at layered paint and objects on the surface of the canvas. Layered, which is important, layers of history. We see collages of newspaper articles about Native Americans, about Native American life, taken from tribal newspapers. But we also see photographs, comics, tobacco wrappers, gum wrappers, fruit carton labels, ads, all of the things that show Native Americans in a very stereotypical negative light. She focuses on Native American issues like poverty, unemployment, disease, alcoholism, addiction to gambling. There are also layered on here photos of deer and buffalo and Native men in historical dress, and wearing their feathers and holding their pipes. We see a combination of colors, the red, which is I said is symbolic of the spilled blood, but also of anger and that sort of thing. We're definitely looking at abstract expressionist. There's definitely places where the paint has gone on in brush strokes, but also places where the paint has gone on so thick that it's dripping. And so when we look just at the canvas, that's what we're looking at, this collage of historical documents and pictures. When we look up above the canvas, and I'm going to zoom in a minute, but I really want to talk about it before we're zooming in. When we look above the canvas, we see things that we are beginning to understand now. This was 92. We're now in, 20, what year is it? 2020. And so we're almost in 2022. And so we're looking at, 30 years after this, and we're finally starting to get that some of this stuff is incredibly offensive. We're looking at things like the Washington Redskin logo, the Cleveland Indians pennant, the Atlanta Braves pennant, red man chewing tobacco, children's toys that are called Indian tomahawk, Indian headdress, Indian quiver and arrows, a plastic Native American doll that is incredibly stereotypical and inaccurate. And so what we're looking at when we look at the title and we look at the piece and we look at the trinkets hanging above it, and that's what she calls it, she calls them trinkets, what we're seeing is Smith offering these trinkets, cheap goods, tchotchkes, all this stuff to white people in exchange for the land that was lost. And clearly, the government of Manhattan will say, well, it's not a fair trade. This thing for the entire island of Manhattan, to which Quick to See and many Jean Quick to See and many of her painting people that work at her same level in the Native American community. That's what they're saying. The deal that was made to get Manhattan from them was not a fair deal. These items show a cheapening of Native American culture and Native American pride and Native American beliefs, and it is taken down to something that is sell, sell, sell. This is her speaking up about this. So when you look at it, you can see you have some animals here, Sitting Bull there. No, that's Chief Joseph. And then you see some other ads and things like that down here, and the blood red paint dripping. There's chewing tobacco labels here. If you don't know what that looks like, look up Red Man chewing tobacco. There's just these really awful stereotypical things. So why did I say that she's also speaking about some of the issues that happen on Native American reservations? So we're dealing with extreme poverty because the government doesn't fund as well as it should, high unemployment, diseases because the government restricts a lot of things, including healthcare, a high level of alcoholism because the government sells alcohol cheaply to Native American reservations who can then resell it and make a profit. And they do that with alcohol and tobacco. And so there's a high rate of alcoholism, a high rate of smoking in Native American reservations. And before gambling became really a place, something that you could do in a lot of places, there were very few places that you could gamble. Atlantic City, New Jersey, Las Vegas, Nevada, and Native American reservations. And so a high rate of gambling in Native American reservations too. It's just trying to bring attention to sort of the way that the forming of reservations and the funding of reservations has really negatively impacted the entire population of reservations. So what are we looking at? Social commentary, multimedia, European influences, like the influence of de Kooning. Let's look at some of these things. I mean, look at the Chiefs, the Atlanta Braves, Washington Redskins. I'm sorry, that's Cleveland Indians. The Florida Seminoles. Look at this doll. It is terrible. Here's that red man chewing tobacco right there. And then there's alcohol and play moccasins and all of these things that are this beaded, necklace that no Native American would wear. It should remind you a little bit of the pieces that Kadzi Cody did, the painted elk hide that are done for consumption and not for real use, as is this headdress. It's just really it's really terrible. And so that's what she's trying to point out to people. Okay. Moving on from that is a very, very different piece. And that's another thing I love about contemporary is there's so many different media and there's so many different thought processes and so many different places that the art is from and so many different things to comment on. It's really, as opposed to studying, Europe of the 1940s, where pretty much everybody is commenting on the same thing. When we do global contemporary, we're dealing with, from 1980 to 2020, we're dealing with 40 years of art around the world that's going to comment about different things. And so Art's Creation by Emily Kangware she is an Australian Aborigine artist. And what this doesn't reflect, and it's really important that you know, is it says synthetic polymer paint on canvas. And yeah, the polymer is new and the canvas is whatever, but what it doesn't say in its description is that this is synthetic polymer paint on linen, which is then mounted on canvas. She paints on linen first because it's easier for her to get the linen in the size that she wants, and then she mounts that linen on top of the canvas. Um, and so it's an interesting concept of how to paint. It gives her a little more freedom because it's not stretched quite as thin. I'm sorry, as quite as tight when she's painting it as it then becomes when it's placed onto the stretcher with the canvas. It's huge, 20 feet by 9 feet. So let's talk about who she is. Kungwari is an Australian Aboriginal artist. She was born in 1910. This one, Earth's Creation, is one of a series of 22. So you could compare this as crazy as it sounds to Rubens' Marie de' Medici cycle, which is crazy. You could compare this to Hokusai's 36 Views of Mount Fuji. What are we looking at? We are looking at lots of color and lushness, and it is meant to simulate the color and lushness of what is called the green time in Australia, which is when it rains in the outback. During the rainy season, which is not very often, once a year and not for very long. And it rains for a while, and then everything in the outback is green and lush and wonderful. And then the rain stops and everything dries up again, and it all goes back to that sort of, earthy clay brownie red. And so she is simulating, this beautiful green time. What you see here is what's interesting. You see these do 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 these dots. She uses a technique called a dump dot technique, which is where you use the brush and you pound the paint into the canvas. It pushes the paint in, it allows it to push and splatter as it goes in. It then creates layers of paint because you let that dry a little bit, and then you can push and dot and a dot dump on top of that. So you can have layers of paint on top of each other. And with that, you get these beautiful dots, but you also get these wonderful lines too when she dots and then moves the brush, and she gets these great brush strokes. And so we have a lot of implied movement here. You can see the rain, you can see the movement of things growing. This is often compared to Monet, particularly Monet's water lilies, long format, it's very long, 20 feet long. This long format, beautiful nature scene. It's done in 4 panels because it's so powerful and impressive. So she grew up in a small desert community, and she trained in painting for Aboriginal ceremony work. So she painted things that were necessary for ceremonial purposes. But then, she became internationally famous when she was 80, but she was painting her whole life. So it's not like suddenly she became, suddenly at 80 she decided to paint. But what happened is, let's think about her life. The land she lived on was occupied by European settlers, okay, in like the 1920s. And so the Europeans came into Australia, her part of Australia in the 1920s, and were just like, hey, we own this. And then eventually Aboriginal land was legally freed in the late 1970s, 1976, I think. And she was an elder in the community, and she created art and ceremonial, what are called dream paintings, that were made of the sand around them and natural materials around them that were meant to tell the story of the creation of the earth and the way that the ancestors created the earth and how the earth was formed and how the earth grows. And so she painted these, all of her life for her Aboriginal tribe, and tribe is an appropriate word there. You could also say Aboriginal community. And so in 1988, the Australian government decided that they were going to do these grants for people to share the art of the Aboriginal community, because they believed that it was a it was a history that was disappearing. And so they heard about her and they said, ooh, we want to give you some money. And so this is part of the grant that she got in 1994 to compose pieces about the Aboriginal beliefs and the ancestral history and things like that. So she has always painted, but in 1994 she gets this grant from the Australian government who wants to, solidify this Australian history, who wants to preserve this Aboriginal storytelling. And so she created this piece as one of 22, and she continued to paint for the rest of her life. She died several years ago. But this piece was created to be part of those earth tones, and but also the introduction of those beautiful greens from the rain. It was meant to be more geometric than soft, so you see a lot of straight lines, and so it becomes a huge hit when the exhibit in '94 goes up. I'm sorry, in '88 goes up for. Not this one in particular. When the exhibit in '88 goes up for the Aboriginal exhibit, she becomes an international success. And people flock to see her work. And so this is a later work, but the works that she creates are just beautiful and they're huge. I mean, and here she is sitting, slumped over with this big giant brush, making lines and making dots. And you can see the scale of how large they are. And this is work that, like I said, that she did her whole life. And in order to preserve the story of her people. And so landscape, nature and earth, large format paintings. So this is our piece, Earth's Creation, so that you could see what it looked like. And our piece, the 1994 piece that we're looking at was in the Venice Biennale, which is, when we talked about Kusama, we know is a really, really big deal. And so, she has this wonderful loose style and the loose composition and a big palette, but it doesn't feel overwhelming. It's really stunning work. And so we have, Jean Quick-to-See, who speaks about Native Americans. We have Emily Kame Kangware, who speaks about Aboriginal life. And now we're going to look at Sharon Nishat, who is going to speak about, through her art, the life of someone who is from Iran, and what that looks like and what we need to think about when we look at that. And so this particular piece is called Rebellious Silence. It is from it's a work in a series. Oh, look, another series called The Women of Allah. So what you see here is Sharon Nishat is the artist. She is also the person depicted in this photograph. So she's also the person depicted in the photograph, but she clearly is, unlike Cindy Sherman, she is not she's not the photographer. The photograph was taken by Cynthia Preston, but at the direction of Sharon Nishat. So this is a piece from 1994. And what you should be looking at right now is you should be thinking, whoa, what's going on with this materials? It says ink on photograph. Correct. So Sharon Nishat has Cynthia Preston take this photograph, and then it is printed in very large format. I mean, look how big this is, 56 inches by 39 inches. And she has it printed out, and then after it's printed out, she goes back and she writes on it. And the things that she writes on it are, we'll talk about that in a minute. So let's first talk about what we see in this photograph. We see a woman. We see the writing on her face, which is added to the photograph after it's printed. We see her in what is called a chador, and we're going to talk for just 2 seconds so that you know what you're looking at. When you wear just the scarf on your head, it's a hijab. When you wear this thing that pretty much covers all of you except your face and your hands, that's a chador. You're going to notice the chador comes down a little further. Hijab can come back here. Chador comes much closer to the eyebrows. Then there's the one that's called a niqab, which is the one, again, like the chador, where everything is covered except the eyes. So a niqab it covers even the forehead and everything below the eyes. And then finally, the burqa, which is where even the eyes are covered. So I just want to make sure that, when we teach this, we teach appropriate language too. So just the simple headscarf is hijab. This, where the face and hands are visible, it's called a chador. Please don't call it a burqa. A burqa is totally different. Okay, so we're looking at Shirin Nishat in this photograph, and we see that she has this gun, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we're looking at. But first, we're going to talk about Shirin Nishat because we need to know about our artists, especially when we're in contemporary. We really need to know who our people are to know why they look the art looks the way it was. So she was born in Iran. And then when she was younger, they moved to America because of the coming of the destabilization from excuse me, from Islamic extremism. And so excuse me, I'm going to take a drink real quick. Oh, much better. And so what you see is the one in a series by a woman who grew up in her formative years in Iran, and then moved to America to avoid the Islamic Revolution. When she was born in Iran in 1957, the Shah was okay with women having rights and women going to school, and women didn't have to wear the veil, and there was no, segregation by gender. If you read Persepolis, you know what I'm talking about. If you didn't read Persepolis, find it. It's an amazing graphic novel about how Iran went from being an incredibly progressive country to being the sort of barbaric place that it is now. So her family saw her family saw the problems coming and realized that they needed to leave, and so they moved to California. And then 9/11 happened, and she said that when 9/11 happened, it changed even more how people saw her. And so she has a whole nother series which came out after 9/11, which really focuses very much on the way that Westerners see those who are from Iran. And so you have to remember that this piece is pre 9/11. And so I'm not sure that she could do exactly this piece after 9/11. But what she was trying to is, okay, so she moves to California in like 1978. And everything happens with the Shah, and he's overthrown, and the Islamic extremists come in, and things start to quiet down some. And she returns to Iran to visit in 1991 and to see her country. And she said everything was so different. Everyone had a veil. Everything was different. It wasn't this wonderful place of learning and progress and that she remembered. And she was so struck by the difference between what life was like when she left in 1978 and what it was like when she went for a visit in 1991, that she created this piece. And so now let's talk about this piece. Okay. This piece is the whole series is meant to reflect sort of the changes in the region in Iran after the Islamic Revolution. And there are a lot of things going on here in this piece. So what is the purpose of the chador? According to Muslim tradition, women need to be covered. They need to be, they can't be, I've literally just forgotten the word for it, but they need to cover themselves, to be modest. There's the word, I finally got it. Women need to be modest. And so the chador um, the niqab and the burqa are meant to enforce that modesty. The wearing of a veil is Old Testament, which is why women cover their hair in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, because it's all connected to Old Testament stories. And remember, we learned about this when we were learning about West and Central Asia, that the three major religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all share a basic background, and all believe that in the same God. They may call it a different thing, but they all believe in the same God. And that the original background shifts at historical points in the Bible. When Islam breaks off is with Abraham, and then Christianity breaks off with Jesus, but they share a common belief. So the wearing of a veil is very common, to cover the hair, to increase that modesty. That is then ramped up with the coming of the Islamic Revolution, to the point that, in some places women are required to wear the burqa, which even covers the eyes. It's a lace covering in front that you can see through. And it's meant to, if you ask people who wear, and you have to remember, let's start with that. There are women who wear hijab, chador, niqab, and burqa by choice. It is how they see their religious need. There are Christian women who don't believe that you should ever cut your hair and that you shouldn't wear pants, right? There are Jewish people that are very strict in their diet. You don't mix milk and meat, and there are Jewish people who will eat, a cheeseburger. It depends on the level of orthodoxy that you take your religion to. So remember, as you're looking at this is not always a bad thing when you see a woman in a burqa or a hijab. You need to do your homework, and know, are they being forced to wear this or not? And so the Women of Allah series says that the chador is meant to keep women from being a sexualized object. The Women of Allah series is meant to look at the complexity of the identity of a woman in the very quickly changing landscape that was the Middle East. What that looks like through the lens of a woman, what that looks like through the lens of a Muslim woman, what that looks like through the lens of a Western woman. And how do we interpret the things that we see? If I put this up here and your first thought was, why is that woman covered? Women shouldn't have to cover themselves like that. That is your own personal bias. You have to remember, some women wear these on by choice, and so she's trying to get you to realize that orthodoxy in religion is not the same as extremism in religion. And what's wonderful about this is this was even before 9/11, and she's trying to tell you, please don't confuse women who are orthodox and believe strongly in the rules of their faith with women who are extremists and take their faith to a level that is not appropriate and not guided really by their religious text. And so that's what she's asking you to look at. She's asking you to look at things that are intimate, things that are personal, things that reveal religious conviction. And so what are we looking at? We are looking at a woman who has a poem written on her face. Poem is in Farsi. It's the language of Iran. And the poem is by a poet called Tahera Safardadeh, Saffarzadeh. And the poem is titled Allegiance with Wakefulness. And it is a poem by an Iranian female poet, and there are many of them, who writes about piety and gender issues and the idea of honoring religious conviction. And so Westerners often see this as women being oppressed, but Iranians see it as being obedient. And then you get to the place where you separate from this poem and you begin to look at the iconography. And so this is that line, technically a line between orthodoxy and extremism. And there's a poem that very much could be read that um, that martyrdom is brave, and that it is being obedient to die for your faith. And so she's trying to point out that you can misread any text. And so she wants you to think about, what do you see here? It's in two parts, okay? Right? We have the line down the center, a literal line down the center. It's literally bisected. It's dark on this side and light on this side. So we have that juxtaposition. We have so much juxtaposition in this piece. We have the juxtaposition of the black and the white, the dark and the light. Okay. We have the juxtaposition of the the more Western uh, interpretation versus the more extreme interpretation, and you could call it an extremist interpretation versus a orthodox interpretation. Those are the words. The gun here adds that tension. It adds that ominous feeling. You have to decide where on the line you are. It's balanced. It's symmetrical. This piece, but what we are looking at is really the Eastern version versus the Western version. And so what do I mean by that? The colors are actually backward, the shading, but the Eastern version, the Middle Eastern version of this could be the extremism that was in Iran in 1994. Think about what was happening in Iran in 1994. It was horrible. Versus the more orthodoxy that you see in America. Okay, we're looking at Orthodox Muslims versus extremism Muslims. It's the balance between East and West. It's the balance between tradition and modernity. It's the balance between being pious, believing in your religion, versus being violent. Okay. It has so many things. It's sad, it's powerful, it's quiet, it's intense, it's ominous, it's very powerful, and this could not be shown in Iran. Even prior to 9/11, and now it would definitely not be shown in Iran. And her work is very popular. It's very beautiful. She uses different poems for different pieces. She often quotes Hafez, who's probably the most famous Persian poet. Um, this is Sharon Ashad. This is what she actually looks like when she's not in costume. You can see another large format poster behind her with the writing on it. It's a portrait. We're looking at ink techniques. We can also talk about social commentary. I don't always put everything on here. Here are some of the others. Just sometimes old women. This is someone who it's about death and martyrdom. Her pieces are powerful. They are large. They are, in retrospect, looking at them, they were very telling. She had this idea of the difference between, and I can't come back to it enough, the difference between orthodoxy and extremism. And there is a huge difference between the two of them. And she warns about the dangers of extremism because she and her family were very much affected by extremism. Um, some of them, I mean, look at this beautiful close up of the eye and pieces here. This is one of my favorites. This is pieces from the Shahnameh, which we studied, with very violent imagery going along with it. This is my favorite one. And because when you first look at it, you see the face, then you kind of see the writing, you think this is an earring, and then you're like, oop, that's the barrel of a gun. And here you see her in her very traditional techniques. I mean, we're looking at very modern, huge format photography, and then traditional hand calligraphy, because in Islam, the greatest calling of an artist is to be a calligrapher. And so modern and traditional. She's very, very popular and very, very talented. So some of them are in red too. Wonderful. They're beautiful. So that is trade, Earth's creation, and the women of Allah. So we'll see you in a little bit for day 5 of contemporary and talk to you later.